In anger, a person is capable of very, very terrible things that he may regret later. The husband finds his wife cheating at home, in their bedroom, but he chose to remain unnoticed so that he could then take his terrible revenge. Hello, my dear viewer. Listen to this story and leave your opinion in the comments. Whether the hero of this story did the right thing, although his act was very terrible. And while you're listening, don't forget to put your gorgeous like and subscribe to the channel. Let's go. James's car glided smoothly into the driveway, the engine purring softly as it faded into the evening stillness. He had returned earlier than expected from his business trip, hoping to surprise Charlotte after a grueling period filled with endless meetings and nights devoted to strategic planning. The sunset painted the sky in hues of gold and pink, giving their upscale neighborhood a tranquil glow. As James entered their spacious home, a wave of exhaustion and anticipation washed over him. He set his briefcase by the door and sighed with relief, glad to be home earlier than usual. James called out for Charlotte, expecting to hear her usual cheerful response, but the house greeted him with a troubling silence that immediately unsettled him. Climbing the stairs toward their bedroom, he felt a growing sense of unease. Had she gone out? The thought flickered in his mind, but he dismissed it when he heard faint sounds coming from the far end of the hallway, muffled voices, the rustle of sheets, and restrained, almost playful laughter. A knot of fear tightened in his chest as he approached the bedroom door. His hand trembled as he slowly turned the knob, the door creaking open with a soft groan. What he saw next shattered his world in an instant. On the luxurious bed they had shared for many years, a scene of betrayal unfolded before his eyes. Charlotte, his wife of 20 years, was entwined with another man. Their bodies were positioned in a way that left no room for ambiguity. The man, whom James had never seen before, awkwardly tried to sit up, his face flushing with embarrassment. In a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, James stood frozen, his mind struggling to process the painful reality before him. Inside, a storm of emotions raged: shock, disbelief, and heart-wrenching pain. James had always trusted Charlotte, believing in the foundation of their marriage, despite the occasional arguments over finances or lifestyle choices. Finally, he found the strength to speak, though his voice was thick with suppressed emotion. "Charlotte," he rasped, his throat tightening with anguish. His gaze slowly shifted from Charlotte's tear-streaked face to the man beside her, who avoided eye contact like a criminal caught in the act. Charlotte's face twisted with horror and shame as she hastily pulled the sheets around herself. "James, I can explain everything," she stammered, her voice trembling with panic. The man hurriedly gathered his clothes, muttering incoherent apologies under James's icy stare, but his words felt empty and meaningless in the face of what had happened. James said nothing more. His jaw clenched, he fought to keep his emotions from spilling over. Without a second glance at either of them, he turned and walked out of the room, each step heavy with the weight of betrayal. The door closed quietly behind him, severing them from the heartbreaking scene, leaving Charlotte alone with the consequences of her actions. In the oppressive silence that followed, Charlotte collapsed onto the bed, her body shaking with uncontrollable sobs. Guilt, regret, and the cold realization of what she had done overwhelmed her. James's silent departure was more damning than any words he could have spoken. The depth of his pain was clear, and the unspoken accusation hung in the air. Time seemed to stand still as Charlotte grappled with the enormity of her betrayal. How had it come to this? Forbidden desire and the craving for new experiences had clouded her judgment, obscuring the inevitable consequences. The sound of James's footsteps descending the stairs pierced the suffocating quiet, bringing with it the realization that he had left without a word. His departure underscored the magnitude of the destruction she had caused. Tears blurred her vision as the scene replayed over and over in her mind, the weight of regret growing heavier with each passing second. She desperately wished she could turn back time, undo what could no longer be undone. Suddenly her phone rang, cutting through the spiral of her thoughts like an electric jolt. Her hands trembled as she picked up the phone, her heart pounding in her chest. The number was unfamiliar, and a wave of anxiety washed over her as she answered. Charlotte had no idea that this call would plunge her into a nightmare she couldn't even begin to imagine. Sitting in shock on the edge of the bed, her emotions in complete turmoil, she had no clue what lay ahead. James's silent exit left her bewildered, and now she had no idea what to expect as the full weight of her actions sank in. Helpless, she watched him leave, feeling the chasm between them grow with each step he took. His expression resembled a calm storm, the kind of pain that cuts deeper than any angry words. When the door quietly clicked shut behind him, Charlotte was left alone, crushed under the weight of her actions. Tears streamed down her face, mingling with the bitter taste of regret on her lips. She had expected James to explode, to hurl accusations, but the silence after his departure was far more unbearable. That silence echoed with the sound of shattered trust, a wound she feared might never heal. The following days felt like moving through a dense fog of routine. Charlotte continued with her duties, cooking, shopping, taking care of the house, but everything felt empty. Every action reminded her of the chasm that had opened between them. James, once attentive and always nearby, was now distant, as if he had hidden behind a wall of cold silence. The warmth of his daily messages and calls had vanished, leaving only an icy indifference that made Charlotte feel lonely and lost. Night after night she lay awake, replaying that moment in their bedroom over and over, trying to understand his unnerving calm. Maybe he's still processing it, she whispered to herself, clinging to the fragile hope that he might find it in his heart to forgive her. She convinced herself that their marriage was strong enough to weather this storm, that his love would be able to heal the wound she had inflicted. But beneath the surface of their daily life, tension was building, like a volcano on the brink of eruption. His silence, more than any words, was a constant reminder of her guilt, a weight pressing on her soul. She longed to reach out, to beg for forgiveness, but each time she tried, it seemed as though James retreated even further. One evening, as Charlotte set the table with trembling hands, the distance between them became unbearable. The rift had grown too wide to ignore. Deciding that things could no longer continue this way, she headed to the study where James had taken to spending his evenings after work. She hoped that, somehow, she could break through the wall he had built. When she found him, he was sitting at his desk, his laptop open in front of him, but his thoughts seemed far away. The soft glow of the desk lamp cast shadows on his weary face. He glanced at her briefly as she entered, his expression unreadable. "James," she began, her voice trembling as she struggled to find the right words. "We need to talk." James's eyes remained fixed on the screen, his fingers lightly tapping the keys. He didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge her presence, except for that fleeting glance. The silence between them grew heavier with each passing second. Gathering her strength, Charlotte pressed on, her voice faltering under the weight of everything unsaid. I'm so sorry," she whispered, tears flowing once again. "I don't know why I did it. I never meant to hurt you." Finally, James looked at her, their eyes meeting, his gaze filled with sorrow and exhaustion that pierced her to the core. "Charlotte," he said quietly, his voice laced with weariness, "I trusted you. I believed in us." Each word tightened its grip on her heart like a vice, squeezing harder with every syllable. She reached out, desperately wanting to touch him, to feel some kind of connection, but he gently pulled away, his eyes dropping back to the desk. "I don't know if I can forgive this," he murmured, barely audible. "I need time." His words crashed over her like a wave, and Charlotte's heart sank under the weight of his admission. She had held on to hope for reconciliation, but James's honesty shattered it in an instant. With a broken heart, she left the study, her steps heavy with the burden of defeat, leaving James alone with his inner torment. Days turned into weeks as they tried to navigate life among the fragile remnants of their marriage. James buried himself in work, staying late at the office and leaving earlier every morning, growing further and further from their shared life. Charlotte, desperately trying to close the widening gap between them, did everything she could. She cooked his favorite meals, left sincere notes filled with apologies and love, but every effort was met with the same cold silence, only deepening her despair. Over time, she convinced herself that the silence meant forgiveness, that somehow they would heal and rebuild what had been lost. She buried her guilt beneath a facade of normalcy, clinging to the belief that their life could return to what it had been. But beneath James's calm exterior, a storm was brewing, a plan that would soon shake their world to its core. 3 weeks passed in a fog of awkward silences and Charlotte's unbearable guilt. She had no idea that their lives were about to be turned upside down once again. She immersed herself in the mundane routines of daily life, clinging desperately to the faint hope that her marriage could survive her betrayal. But that fragile hope was irrevocably shattered by one fateful phone call. It was a quiet Thursday when Charlotte's phone vibrated, the abrupt sound cutting through the silence of the house. For a moment, she froze, hesitating before answering. A heavy sense of dread clenched her stomach as she glanced at the unfamiliar number glowing on the screen. "Hello," she said, her voice already trembling as though her instincts knew something was terribly wrong. "Is this Charlotte Smith?" asked a gruff voice on the other end, confirming her identity. "This is Sergeant Miller from the station. I'm afraid I have some bad news." Charlotte's heart pounded, her breath caught as a wave of terror washed over her. "What? What happened?" she asked, barely able to keep her voice steady, fear seeping into every word. "We found a body," Sergeant Miller continued, and each word struck her like a hammer. "It was in the trunk of your car." The ground fell away from beneath her as reality began to slip from her grasp. Her thoughts raced, desperately trying to reject this horrifying fact. "No, no, that's impossible," she muttered, disbelief and fear filling her voice. "You need to come down to the station, Miss Smith," the sergeant said, his tone calm but laced with suspicion. "We have a few questions to ask you." Numb with shock, Charlotte ended the call, mechanically preparing to leave. As she walked past James, who was working in his office, he looked up, his face tightening at the sight of her pale face and trembling hands. "Charlotte, what's going on?" His concern was evident as he stood and approached her. Her eyes filled with tears, and she struggled to find the words. They found a body," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of guilt. James's expression darkened instantly, suspicion and disbelief clouding his features. "Whose body?" he asked, his voice low and controlled, though tension simmered beneath the surface. In the trunk of my car," Charlotte whispered, her voice so quiet it was barely audible. James stared at her, searching for the truth in her eyes, his fists clenching at his sides. "Charlotte, what happened?" he demanded, his voice steady, but his body trembling with barely contained anger. "I don't know," she sobbed, tears streaming down her face. "I swear, James, I don't know how it got there." A heavy silence hung between them, filled with unspoken accusations they both understood but couldn't voice. James's mind raced, piecing together fragments, her infidelity, her strange behavior, and now this horrific discovery. His pulse quickened as the full implications of the moment hit him. "We need to go," James finally said, his voice sharp as he headed for the door. "Now!" The drive to the station was unbearable, the air in the car thick with tension. Charlotte sat still beside James, her hands clenched in her lap, her gaze fixed out the window, gripped by fear and disbelief. When they arrived at the station, Sergeant Miller greeted them with a curt nod and led them to a dark, cramped interrogation room. Charlotte's heart raced as they walked, her mind frantically searching for explanations, but nothing could erase the reality. There was a body in her car. "Mrs. Smith, Mr. Smith," Sergeant Miller began, sitting across from them, his tone serious. "I'll be frank. This morning we discovered the body of a man in the trunk of your car. The victim has been identified as Alexander Lee, someone we believe you knew." Charlotte's breath caught at the mention of Alexander's name, her worst nightmare becoming reality in that moment. She struggled to control her emotions, desperately trying to suppress the overwhelming waves of guilt and fear that threatened to consume her. "I don't understand," she said, her voice trembling and filled with anxiety. "The circumstances surrounding Mr. Lee's death are highly concerning," Sergeant Miller said, staring intently at Charlotte. "The evidence we've gathered points directly to you." Charlotte's eyes widened in shock, her thoughts racing frantically to process what she had just heard. "No, no, that's impossible," she exclaimed, panic creeping into her voice. "I didn't do it. I would never hurt him." James sat silently beside her, his face unreadable, offering no words of comfort. He seemed lost in his own thoughts, silently digesting the accusations leveled against his wife. Inside him a storm of emotions raged, anger, betrayal, and a growing suspicion that Charlotte's infidelity had led to something far more sinister. "We found blood in your car, Miss Smith," Sergeant Miller continued, his voice calm but unwavering. "Witnesses also saw you arguing with Mr. Lee shortly before his disappearance." Charlotte's desperate denials seemed to vanish under the weight of the mounting evidence, each word adding to an unbearable burden. She looked at James, hoping to see even a flicker of belief in her innocence. But his eyes remained cold and distant, a reflection of the shattered pieces of their broken marriage. As the interrogation dragged on, Charlotte found it increasingly difficult to speak, her attempts to defend herself drowning in the torrent of accusations. She felt herself sinking, overwhelmed by the rising tide of suspicion. Hours passed in a blurred sequence, with relentless questions bombarding her. Each new accusation chipped away at her sense of reality, leaving her clinging to the fragile remnants of her truth. By the end, she realized one devastating fact. Her life had completely unraveled, and there was no escaping the consequences of her actions. Charlotte sat trembling under the harsh light of the interrogation room. Her hands shook uncontrollably in her lap as Sergeant Miller paced methodically in front of her, his tone firm but measured. "Miss Smith, multiple witnesses saw you at the location where Mr. Lee disappeared," he said, his voice carrying an undeniable certainty. "How do you explain the blood we found in the trunk of your car?" I don't know," Charlotte mumbled, fear trembling in her voice. "I didn't hurt him, I swear." Sergeant Miller paused, narrowing his eyes as he scrutinized her. "The evidence suggests otherwise," he snapped. "Mr. Lee's body was found in your car. All the clues point to your involvement." Charlotte's mind raced in panic, desperately trying to find some explanation, some truth that could free her from this nightmare. "But I loved him," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "I would never have harmed him." "Love can drive people to dangerous actions, especially when trust is broken," Sergeant Miller responded with a hint of skepticism. "I didn't kill him!" she screamed, her voice trembling with desperation. "I didn't do it!" The questions continued, each one cutting deeper into her relationship with Alexander Lee, each accusation tightening the net around her. Through tears, she spoke of their affair, her words laced with guilt, yet she swore she had nothing to do with his murder. With each passing hour, Charlotte's hope faded. The mountain of evidence grew, a damning collection of DNA, surveillance footage, and witness testimonies of their arguments, all weaving an inescapable web around her. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in on her, as the grim reality became impossible to deny. All the while, she cast pleading looks at James. He remained silent, his expression distant, no longer the supportive partner she once knew. She longed for even a glimmer of his belief in her, but his silence was deafening, his gaze fixed somewhere far away, as if he had already let her go. "James, please," Charlotte whispered during a brief pause, her voice broken under the weight of emotion. "You have to believe me. I didn't kill him." James looked at her with cold, distant eyes, his face unreadable. The tension in his clenched jaw betrayed the storm of emotions he was holding back. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice steady but heavy. "Charlotte." Her name hung in the air, stripped of warmth. The tenderness it once carried was gone. "I don't know what to believe anymore." His words hit her like a crushing blow, shattering the last fragile hope she had been clinging to. She had already destroyed their relationship, their marriage with her reckless actions, and now she was facing the consequences of a crime she swore she didn't commit, no matter how desperately she denied her guilt. The pain in James's eyes reflected her own. They both found themselves trapped in the same nightmare, a hell that had torn their lives apart. Days and nights blurred together as the investigation dragged on, and with each passing moment, the chasm between them grew wider. James buried himself deeper in his work, deliberately avoiding her as if it could shield him from the pain. The man who had once been her rock, her unwavering support, had become a ghost in their home. Fear and despair pressed down on Charlotte, but despite everything, she held on to a faint hope that she could prove her innocence. Somehow she had to clear her name and salvage what remained of their shattered life. But the evidence continued to pile up against her. Every new revelation, test results, witness testimonies, incriminating details, only deepened her despair. The media seized on the case, painting her as a heartless killer, plastering her face on front pages and television screens. Her life was falling apart, crumbling under the weight of public condemnation and the unbearable pressure of the investigation. One evening, as she sat alone in the dimly lit living room, lost in thought, a sudden knock at the door shattered the oppressive silence. Her heart raced as she approached the door, her pulse pounding in her ears. Through the frosted glass, she could barely make out the figures of Sergeant Miller and another officer waiting on the porch. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door. Sergeant Miller's expression was grim. "Miss Smith," he said darkly, "we have a warrant for your arrest." The ground fell out from under her. The horror of the situation crashed down on her with full force. She protested over and over, insisting on her innocence, her voice hoarse from the effort. But now she stood on the brink of a nightmare with no escape. As the officers cuffed her wrists, Charlotte stole one last glance at James, who stood in the shadows of their home. His face was a blank canvas of anger, pain, and betrayal, yet there was no forgiveness in his eyes. Alone in the back seat of the police car, Charlotte stared out the window at the familiar streets, now bathed in the harsh glow of streetlights. The distant wail of sirens echoed in her ears like a sinister soundtrack to her crumbling life. She knew her choices had led her here, and now the consequences were closing in on her from all sides. The ride to the police station became a blur of flashing lights, tense silence, and the relentless ache of uncertainty. She clung to a fragile hope that somehow the truth would come to light, that James would see beyond the accusations and believe in her again. But as they fingerprinted her and locked her in a cold, sterile cell, she realized that the road ahead would be full of doubt and regret, and her future was hanging by a thread. In the days following her arrest, Charlotte's life became a fog of legal battles, unrelenting media scrutiny, and the suffocating weight of public opinion. The comfort and stability she once knew had vanished, replaced by the harsh reality of being charged with murder. When the day of her indictment finally arrived, the sky overhead was dull and mercilessly gray, a fitting backdrop for the grim atmosphere in the courtroom. James sat in the gallery, his gaze fixed on her as she was led into the courtroom under guard. Shackled and pale, her face showed a mix of determination and fear. The trial had become a media circus, with newspaper headlines filled with speculation about her involvement in Alexander Lee's death. Charlotte's name had become synonymous with scandal, and every move she made was scrutinized by the world. As she took her seat beside her attorney, Elizabeth Brown, a young but fiercely determined lawyer, the cameras clicked frantically, capturing her every gesture. "Charlotte Smith, you are charged with the murder of Alexander Lee," the judge's voice echoed through the courtroom, delivering the crushing weight of the accusation. Those words reverberated in Charlotte's mind, each beat striking like a hammer blow. The charges felt unbearable, almost suffocating, and she could barely comprehend the nightmare that had unfolded around her. Elizabeth Brown stood with unwavering confidence, her voice firm amidst the tense atmosphere of the courtroom. "Your Honor, my client pleads not guilty to all charges," she declared, locking eyes with the judge. On the opposite side, Prosecutor Daniel Morton wasted no time, immediately delving into the prosecution's case. Witness after witness took the stand, painting a troubling picture of the tumultuous relationship between Charlotte and Alexander Lee. Their testimonies described fierce arguments and suspicious behavior in the weeks leading up to Alexander's sudden disappearance. Forensic experts carefully presented evidence, each piece further entangling Charlotte in the web of crime. Traces found at the crime scene, along with incriminating items in her car, painted a grim picture of her involvement. Sitting in the audience, James watched the trial unfold, his face remaining expressionless as he listened to the accumulating evidence against his wife. Journalists closely monitored him, hoping to catch even the slightest hint of his reaction, but he remained detached. His silence left everyone wondering whether he still supported Charlotte or had already condemned her. As the trial progressed, Charlotte struggled to maintain her composure, though the image of a cold-blooded killer crafted by the prosecution weighed heavily on her. She listened in horror as witness after witness recounted the violent arguments between her and Alexander. The tension in the room escalated when it was revealed that Alexander's body had been found in her car, and DNA tests linked her to the crime scene. The severity of the charges hit Charlotte like a final blow. "Miss Smith," Prosecutor Morton's voice cut through the tense cross-examination, "can you explain why your DNA was found on the murder weapon?" Charlotte's heart raced. Panic gripped her as she struggled to find the words. I don't know," she stammered, her voice trembling. Her hands shook under the pressure, her mind desperately searching for an explanation. Days turned into weeks, and the trial seemed never-ending. More witnesses emerged, more damning evidence surfaced, increasing the pressure. Charlotte clung desperately to the faintest hope, praying that the truth would come to light and set her free. But the prosecution's case grew stronger, casting a suffocating shadow over her dwindling optimism. Each night she returned to her cell, the grim reality sinking deeper into her soul. Elizabeth Brown, tireless in her efforts, frequently visited Charlotte, working relentlessly to build a defense capable of withstanding the overwhelming evidence. She searched for any detail that might prove Charlotte's innocence. But as the trial dragged on, the constant legal battles and harsh public opinion slowly wore Charlotte down. She was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, clinging to the thinnest thread of hope that a missing piece of evidence might save her. What hurt her most was James's absence throughout the trial. She longed for his presence, for a sign that he still believed in her. But his silence created a chasm between them, and Charlotte couldn't shake the thought that he had already made up his mind about her guilt or innocence. One afternoon during a short recess, Charlotte found herself alone with Elizabeth in a quiet corner of the courthouse. The air was heavy with the tension of the ongoing trial, but Elizabeth's unwavering determination gave Charlotte a glimmer of hope. "We need to challenge the evidence, Charlotte," Elizabeth said gently but firmly, her gaze fixed on her client. "The prosecution's case is strong, but we still have options." Charlotte sat silently, her eyes fixed on her clenched hands. "Do you think I still have a chance?" she asked quietly, her voice barely audible, thick with fear. Elizabeth paused for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "It won't be easy," she admitted, her tone serious but full of compassion. "But we're going to fight with everything we have. I believe in your innocence." Tears welled up in Charlotte's eyes as she met Elizabeth's determined gaze. A mix of gratitude and fear surged within her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. As the trial continued, Charlotte braced herself for the difficult days ahead. The prosecution showed no sign of letting up, each new witness and each piece of evidence driving her closer to despair. But despite it all, she held on to Elizabeth's faith in her innocence, clinging to the hope that the truth would finally emerge, that justice would prevail, and that somehow she would piece together the fragments of her shattered life. The courtroom had become a battleground where truth and lies clashed in a spectacle that captivated the public's attention. Charlotte's future hung by a thread, her hope balanced on a fragile strand of redemption, even as the overwhelming weight of the evidence threatened to bury her beneath its shadow. The trial dragged on, and each moment felt like an endless, torturous ordeal. Every day brought new, damning revelations, accompanied by fierce debates in which Charlotte was portrayed as a calculating murderer. As the prosecution neared its climax, Elizabeth Brown fought tirelessly to dismantle this image. However, the weight of the evidence against Charlotte seemed insurmountable. In the courtroom, Charlotte sat in silence, crushed by the enormity of what was happening. Her hands trembled as she listened to the closing arguments. District Attorney Morton vividly described her betrayal, an affair with Alexander Lee, and the cold, methodical steps she allegedly took to cover up his murder. The jurors' eyes were fixed on Morton as he neatly pieced together the final fragments of the case, which would determine Charlotte's fate. When Elizabeth stood for her closing argument, her voice was steady despite the pressure weighing on her. She urged the jury to consider the possibility of reasonable doubt, to challenge the prosecution's narrative, and to recognize the gaps in their circumstantial evidence. But outside the courtroom, public opinion raged, fueled by sensational media reports that threatened to destroy any hope of Charlotte's acquittal. As the jury retired to deliberate, Charlotte's mind filled with fear and despair, with only a faint glimmer of hope that justice might prevail. Time seemed endless as Charlotte waited for their decision. Her heart pounded with each tick of the clock. Elizabeth remained beside her, quietly offering comfort, holding her hand in solidarity. Soon, the jury returned, their expressions solemn as they took their seats. Charlotte held her breath, her eyes locked on their impassive faces as the foreman rose to deliver the verdict. "We find the defendant, Charlotte Smith, guilty of first-degree murder." Those words crashed over the courtroom, shattering Charlotte's world. Chaos erupted. The room filled with gasps of shock. Her supporters reacted in stunned disbelief, and reporters frantically scribbled down every detail, capturing the moment for the news. Elizabeth's face darkened. Her shoulders slumped in defeat as she whispered words of consolation to her devastated client. For Charlotte, it felt as though the ground had been ripped out from under her, plunging her into a nightmare from which there was no escape. The crushing finality of the verdict consumed her, extinguishing the last flickers of hope for a return to her former life. Now, a prison sentence awaited her. James, who had observed the trial with chilling calm, sat in the gallery, his face emotionless. His plan had succeeded. His revenge for Charlotte's betrayal and the destruction of their marriage was complete. Elizabeth, driven by the explosive revelations, resumed her fight for justice. Step by step, she uncovered James's elaborate scheme, how he learned of Charlotte's infidelity, how he turned her unfaithfulness into a tool for revenge, and how he meticulously orchestrated her downfall. Meanwhile, Charlotte languished in prison, tormented by the realization that not only had her own actions betrayed her, but so had the man she once loved and trusted. The thought that James had framed her, ensuring her conviction, haunted her relentlessly. After the trial ended, James left the country in search of his own happiness. My friend, and this is the end of the story. If you liked this story, Then put your royal like and subscribe to the channel. May the force be with you.